Hi, everyone. I'm Nick Werner. I'm with the Georgetown Wargame Society, and it's a pleasure to introduce to you today our speaker, Antoine, who is coming to us from, he's in Italy right now, but he is a French historian and translator, and he teaches game design and wargaming at Paris One University de Sorbonne. And he is currently working on his PhD in the history of wargaming in France. So he's one of the big experts in the French wargaming scene. He also works with the French Department of Defense in designing professional war games with French officers. So please welcome Antoine. You can get started when you're ready.
Hello, everybody. So yes, this is me, Antoine Bourgilleau. I'm currently in Italy. I'm just under Monte Cassino, so it's quite a pleasant view, and I'm in my hotel room at the moment. I'm very grateful for Georgetown University and Sebastian Bay to invited me to make this small talk about the history of the French wargaming, or therefore I would rather say the long but rather thin history of French wargaming, or French jeu de guerre, as we will call it during this discussion. Sorry. Okay. So I wanted to begin my expose with talking about Pascal, which of course many of you may know. Pascal was a French mathematician, and he made lots of mathematical games. And he's also very famous for what we call Pascal's Wager. Pascal's Wager, for those who are not familiar with it, in fact, Pascal was wondering if he could answer a very central question for him: does God exist or not? And so he felt that he could not answer this question. So the question was not asked properly. And so the good question is it worth to believe in God or not? And so basically what he did was a table with two columns and two lines. First column, God exists. Second column, God doesn't. First line, I don't believe in God. Second line, I do believe in God. And so he tried to use his judgment to see what was best. And of course, if you believe in God and God exists, this is purely beneficial and into the infinite, because of course you will be happy in this life and thereafter. And if you do believe in God, but God does not exist, well, it doesn't matter really. But if you don't believe in God and God exists, you're in big trouble. So Pascal's advice was to believe in God because, just in case. I wanted also to talk and to open this with Leibniz and what Gilles Deleuze, which is a famous French thinker, said about the games. Because Leibniz was German, of course, but he was speaking very well French and wrote many articles and pamphlets in French, and particularly one which is called French Kind of Thought, and in which he advocates for the creation of an academy of games, because Leibniz at this time thought that it might be a good idea to use games to teach and to learn things. And so the question for him was, is it possible to use games to go into another world? Before I carry on, I just want to make apologies for my bad English, because I am a translator. I'm used to translate English into French, as Peter Perla is pretty familiar with, because I translated one of his articles in French, but my English is not that good. I'm sorry. Defining wargame. So we have Peter Perla here, and I'm using his definition. A wargame is a warfare model or simulation in which the flow or events shapes and is shaped by decisions made by human players or players during the course of those events. So I wanted to use this definition of wargame because I want to interrogate and to ask if this is a proper definition of wargame, and if one can have a proper definition of wargames. As you may know, many people have tried to give a definition of wargames, and there are many definitions of wargaming. But we are going to start at the late 17th century and in the beginning of also the 18th century, which is a very interesting period, in my opinion, because there are many scientists in France, for instance, Rene or Lamarck, that are trying to get the world together, organize it, try to understand how it works. There is also a plan in France because you have the family, the Cassini family. Cassini family are map makers from Italy. They have an Italian background, obviously. They're called Cassini, and the King of France have ordered them to make maps of all the Kingdom of France. Ironically, their work will be finished just after the Revolution. This is also a period where staff officer schools were born, mainly created by Boissiere or Saint-Germain. And what we see here is a map of the map of the Guerre factice or mock war that you can find in one of Boissiere's treaty that is the most famous, perhaps, is treaty on mountain warfare. So let's begin with La Boissiere's wargame. As you may see, it is more a snake and ladder than a pure wargame. But the question I wanted to ask myself when I began my PhD was, of course, we have all these definitions of wargames, like Peter Perler's definition and many others. But I wanted I just wondered, for La Boissiere, this game is clearly a snake and ladder, but not only, it's also a card game. It's a card game, as you may see, because all the squares can be cut and transformed into a card games. You have spades, clubs, diamonds, hearts. And on each card, as you will see on the next page, on each card, you'll have some definition of a fact of warfare. So here we have the card Reconnoiter. So I gave you the translation of this card. The question is it a war game? In our view today, clearly La Boissiere's game is not a war game, but I consider that perhaps for him at the time, it was a war game. So we must accept the idea that the definition of war game can change, and so that people at the late 18th century or late 17th century, like La Boissiere, thought they were making a war game. It is not a war game in our views and with the definitions we give to war games now, but perhaps and most probably for him, it was. So we're jumping a century and we are going to a Malus game, which is a game from the late 17th century. It is a modern version of the chess, obviously. You have different pieces. So you have one king, of course. You have two queens, which are Christian, the king's guards. You have two knights that are cuirassiers. White bishops become dragoons. Black bishops become hussars. You have 5 cannons, which are the rooks, and 11 fusiliers. And what you see here is the deployment for every player. So you have the king in the center at the back of the line with 2 cannons, and then cannons, hussar, dragons, cuirassier, guard, another cannon, another guard, cuirassier, dragoons, hussars, and cannons, and then on the front, some fusiliers. You have some variants, not very much actually, for moving the pieces, but basically it's still chess with an 11 on 11 squares board, and there is no terrain whatsoever to be represented in this game. So the next game, I wanted to talk about was the Citoyen Giacometti's chess. So it was created by François Giacometti or Francisco Giacometti, because it was first published in Italian in 1793, and then it was published in French at the beginning of the 19th century. So what we see here is a representation of the board. So you have 9 squares times 17 squares, and you can play on 1 against 1. So so you can play on 1 against 1, or you can play on 2 against 2. In which case, the blue line that you see, which represents in the two players game a river, is used to separate the two armies of the players. What is lacking here, I'm sorry, because I can't see why, is that you may see that on each side there is a small square. There is also one here and one here, and there are the fortress where the king is. And there you have the cannons, and in front of the fortifications you have here, you have the armies that are supposed to deploy and to fight. You have only infantry, cavalry, and artillery. There is no distinctions between hussars or cuirassiers or dragoons whatsoever. And the game is very, very close to the chess. The river slows movement for everybody, and the fortifications need to be destroyed by artillery for all the enemy pieces to go inside the fortress and to capture the king. Now we are going to talk about Firmin Perriès' game. Firmin Perriès is a French officer. He was clearly inspired by Helvig. In his game, there is no fixed board, 66 times 40 squares maximum. There is a terrain representation. It has an impact on movement and attacks. And you have siege and field artillery, which have different ranges, and howitzer, and they move like rooks with different paces. But although it's almost like Helvig's translation with not much more modification. This is why I won't talk about it much longer. But we have here, what we have here is something that is mentioned by Firmin Perriès in his preface, which is the cours théorique et pratique du jeu de guerre, which was made by a certain Mr. Kramer in Paris, Rue des Bons Enfants. It's in the center of Paris. And basically, Mr. Kramer was giving a course of wargaming, and he also held a wargame club inside Paris. So I have found this in a small book that was a kind of an almanac that was published in, I think it was in 1803. So basically it was an almanac for lots of people who were making publicity for what they were doing. You have shopkeepers and whatsoever that make advertisements for their goods. And you have this. So Mr. Kramer was providing Helvig's war game, and he was inviting people to come to his place and play Helvig's chess. So next, I would like to talk about Montbrison. Montbrison's Jeu de la guerre de terre et de mer, which was published in 1818. So Montbrison's game is a very strange game indeed. Actually, it's an adaptation, or it's presented as a translation of Tristram Shandy, which you may know was a kind of a big success in the late 18th century. It's a book by Lawrence Sterne in English originally, and Montbrison decided to produce this. In fact, it's a book, as are many games at the time. There is no things as games in boxes, and so Montbrison wrote this book. Montbrison was born just 1 year before Bonaparte. He studied with him at the École de Guerre, and after that, he was mainly an administrator in Strasbourg. So he made this, what he calls an adaptation or a translation of Tristram Shandy, but it's not, it's clearly its creation. And what he did is to create a board. So what you see here is my reconstruction of the boards, because unfortunately, the boards at the time were sold separately from the books. And I haven't been able today, but I still hope I will be able to find one, an original board that was pressed into, they were created by specialist craftsmen in the center of Paris. These people made chessboards mostly, but they also made boards for Montbréson's game. The board was quite expensive, so this is why in almost every library where Montbréson's book is still available, you have no boards. But one of the interesting part of Montbréson's work is that it gives something like a genesis of wargaming, and I can't resist to read what he says about the way wargaming was invented by the uncle Toby. The first day, it was a Monday, my uncle imagined the pontoons to make his infantrymen and his artillery cross the river. As for the cavalry, he wisely decided that they would either use the pontoons or swim across the river as they wished. The second day, my uncle created the sea. He spread it out in peaceful waves on a new chessboard, reserving the solemn beauty of the storms for the landscape artists. These pontoons, which already metamorphosed at will into brigs or gunboats for the convenience of maneuvers or for that of transport, suddenly became ships for sea battles. For my uncle was not a man to multiply irrelevant beings, nor to create sinecures to place his cousins. The same evening, my uncle had a flagship built. On Wednesday morning, the Royal Guard was created. At noon, at the time of the parade, he gave a lieutenant general to command it. On Thursday morning, my uncle organized a corps of engineers and sappers. He divided them between the guard and the line, and by the same spirit of economy, he delegated them to them, in addition, the functions of skirmishers and light infantry. It is believed that it was in the evening of the same day that he discovered the story of the king's imprisonment, and that he devised the means to free this unfortunate prince locked up in the tower. On Friday, my uncle completed his batteries by placing in them teams of gunners who could, if necessary, do the service of the infantry. The next day, early in the morning, he took care of the material of his army. He formed his ammunition and food stores and regulated the service of the treasury, the real nerve of the war. The seventh day was a Sunday, and my uncle rested. So, Montbréson's game is an advanced chess game. It clearly makes allusions to Helvig, Venturini, and so on. So it clearly had the occasion to read these rules and got an inspiration. The cavalry can freely cross the river, but cannot enter the hills and is blockaded by the chevaux de frise. The infantry and the artillery can cross the river on pontons only and can enter hills, but are stopped. Many boards were to be published, but only 3 were. And one of the most fascinating thing is that the board that that was just on the former page was to represent the Battle of Denain. It is I guess it is one of the first occurrence of representation of a real battle. Of course, as he says, the battle and the geography is not very well respected for because he wants every player to have the same opportunity to win. After that, actually, French wargaming, which was not very fruitful, enters in a long sleep. Montbrison died more than 20 years after he wrote his rules and never produced again any kind of rule set, or we don't have any traces of it. The French military did not develop any interest in wargaming when clearly the Prussian army from 1824, as you may know, was using the Kriegspiele von Reiswitz. But after the defeat and the crushing defeat of the Franco-German War, some people in the French military began to have some interest and to develop some interest into wargaming. And so people were trying to use it. What we see here is a representation in a French magazine called L'Illustration. It's an illustration from 1874. And this is an illustration entitled Le jeu de la guerre au cercle des officiers. And there is a short article claiming that wargaming actually was a French invention. It was not. And also telling that French officers are totally enraged with wargaming, that they are wargaming constantly, which is absolutely not the case at the time. We have some samples, though, of wargaming at the École de Guerre. For instance, we have translations of the Freikriegspiel rules from Verdi du Vernois and Meckel. You see here one of the tables that was inspired by Meckel's wargame. But you have to understand that in the French military at the time, there was no, and there has never been a systematic approach to wargaming. People were wargaming here and there, but the Department of Defense and the highest ranks of the army were not interested at all by wargaming and Kriegspiel. How to make it look French? Because this is actually one of the problems. So what you see here on the right is one of the maps that were developed for the translation of Verdi du Vernois and Meckel's rules. And on the left, a small compass that are used to move troops around on the maps. But the main problem is that we are at the time at the late of the 19th century. You may know that this is a period where people are still thinking, and particularly in Europe, in terms of what we call the genius of the race. You know, people consider that Germans, British, French have some kinds of characters, and typically lots of people in the French army consider that wargame is not suited to the French spirit, to the French race. So they consider that it's a German invention. And so it could not be used by French people. So what do we do when we have this kind of problem? Well, you have many articles at the time that are published that insist on the fact that, in fact, it is a French invention. And one of the most absurd claim is that the famous factice, is a campagne factice of Boursiere. So the mock campaign was the first wargame in history. It is clearly not. It is what we would call a review or an after battle report of wargame, but it's not a wargame. There are no rules in the campagne factice from Boursiere. It just imagines that two armies are fighting each other in the Alps. And so it gives informations about the numbers of batteries, battalions, cavalry detachments, and so on. And it develops what each staff officer on each side of the Alps could develop to fight, stop, block, and make some offensive. But clearly, it is not a war game at all. But it was at the time one of the only way people in the French military tried to introduce wargame and to make it a consistent and systematic tool for training and also for planification. But it was, alas, a fail. In 1988, 1988, the commandant Rene wrote a small leaflet called Le Jeu de la Guerre en France. And so he says what he thinks about the Jeu de la Guerre, and he really likes wargaming. He considers that it is a great tool for all we have said, meaning training the officers and also making some planifications. But his conclusions are fourfold. The first is that there is absolutely no interest in the French Department of Defense, or the French Ministère de la Guerre, as we call it at the time. The ministers don't care about the jeu de guerre. And so it's, of course, very hard for it to be employed in the military. Second, which is a consequence of the first, there are no formed referees. And at the time, most of the wargaming, most wargaming is free wargaming. So this is a kind of wargaming that depends heavily on very well-formed referees, and you have no, when you have no referees, you clearly can't have any game of good quality. Many officers consider wargaming as a humbug, and Rene has very strong words against them because he considers that these people are absolutely stupid, and that the only reason why they don't want the wargame to be used in the French army is because it is an activity that will make them look like, well, they are stupid, and so they don't want to look stupid, and this is why they don't want to use wargame. The fourth reason, which might be a surprise for us, is the cost. Today, manual wargame is considered as a great tool, and specifically because it's very cheap, and comparing to simulators, for instance. But at the time, having a box with maps and counters and etc., the games were usually not cheap at all, and so the cost could be also a problem. The army is not the only part of the French military who is not very much convinced by the wargame, to say the least. The Admiral Rene d'Aveluy, which is anyhow a brilliant thinker, wrote in his book L'Esprit de la Guerre Navale in 1910, from a tactical point of view, one must completely repudiate this kind of distraction. So for him, it is a distraction. The combat rests entirely on the intelligence of the command, and the tactics are the only slaves of this intelligence. It is impossible to approach with toys, even from a distance, the reality of warfare. For the French-speaking people here, the term employed for toys is joujou, which is really derogatory. But if the military doesn't have any interest at the time for wargaming, the civilians do. And mainly they come from circles around La Sabrotache and the SCFH, which is the Société des collectionneurs de figurines historiques, Society of Historical Miniatures Collectioners. And these people are interested into wargaming because it gives them an occasion to use their miniatures. Yes, these people use mainly miniatures at the time, flat miniatures, to play war games. What is the most interesting when you read all the bulletins from La Sabrotache and from the SCFH at the time, during the 20s, the 30s, and later, is that it shows that these people have connections with what happens in the US and in England. They have correspondences with Jacques Petit. They also read the rules from Don Featherstone. So, and they make comparison with the rules they produce, because French people at the time also produce stuff. Mainly Fouret and Dodeur, which are two friends from Paris. And in France, it has been more like 30 years, I guess, that I've always heard that the hexagon used in war games was a French invention. It was invented by Fourier, who used it first in the late 30s. It is correct. I don't know if it is the inventor. Of course, he's not the inventor of the hexagon. The hexagon is just a form, but anyhow, Fourier used hexagons, and for a very simple reason, because he was using flat miniatures. And when you are using this kind of miniatures, every time you are moving things all around, they fall, and they fall miserably. Sorry. And so if you want to, so if you don't want them to fall, you have to usually to glue them on cardboard, for instance. But it was also determined that the fact that they were using rules, when they were using rules to measure distance, it used to make all these miniatures fall. And so they got sick about this. And this is why they decided to use hexagons to put their miniatures inside it, and just to have them to move miniatures on the cardboard and not to use any rulers. On the left side of this slide, you can see a guide that was included in one of the bulletins of the SCFH, which was a way they were just showing how you can transform a battlefield into a battlefield with hexagons, and how you can move things around for them to fall into the hexagon. It is something that we all wargamers do know. But what is also interesting in the approach of these French people is that at the time they take wargame very, very, very seriously, and they are much intrigued by the way wargaming is developed in the US and in Britain. And their conclusion are that these people are using wargame in a very different way, and that they need to talk to each other, because in the end, what they do want is to make some kind of rule set to rule them all. They really think that one day it would be possible, and Lord knows we know that it's not, to have wargame rules looking like chess rules that everybody will use in every country for all the kind of wargames we are using. They are still thinking that this is the future of wargaming, one rule set for everybody. I wanted to talk to you now a bit about the 80s and many French magazines that were published at the time. Many of you maybe don't know them. One of the first to be published in France was Jouer Stratégie. As you may see in this first issue, there was a small war game. So Jouer Stratégie was one of the first magazines to talk about games, all games. They were talking about chess, Go, checkers, whatsoever. But they had also strong bias for war games and role-playing games. And almost at the same time, you also had another magazine that were more specialized on wargame and role-playing games, which was called Cassius Belli. And Cassius Belli produced many war games inside, just like the war games you would find in Strategy and Tactics or other kind of war games. But you still had to cut the counters and to glue them on cardboard. It was not that professional. From 1995, Vae Victis was published, and it is still published now, and it's becoming more and more professional now. It is purely a wargame magazine. Cassius Belli used to talk about war games and role-playing games, but in the middle of the 80s, completely stopped to talk about war games and made a full turn on role-playing games only. At the time and during this period in the late 70s and the early 80s, there were many French designers, and I want to talk about all the French designers that mattered at the time. One of the first was Jacques Petit, who published many games in Jouer Strategy and in Casus Belli. On the left, you see the map of his game of Aboukir, the terrible naval battle where the French got a thrashing by Nelson in Egypt. It is a long-time favorite of mine, mainly because it's the first wargame I played with. And on the right side, you have the box of a war game, a novel war game again, made by Paul Bois, which was called Amirauté. It was a very complicated game, really. It was really hard to play more than 2 or 3 ships. But it has inspirations from Jane's Wargames or from Fletcher Pratt's. It was one of the first war games ever published in France. From the Vaevictis team, I also wanted to talk about 3 other French designers, Nicolas Stratigos, Frédéric Bay, and Walter Wojciechowski. Nicolas Stratigos is today the editor-in-chief of Vaevictis. He's for more like than almost 20 years now, and he made lots of very good games like Empreinte Toujours, which was a game about the French Indochina War on the tactical side. Frédéric Bay is also well known because he made lots of Napoleonic and revolutionary war games, which are absolutely excellent. And Walter Wojciechowski is rather a newcomer, but he also made lots of war games on Napoleonic history. And he also published last year a great game about the Battle of Verdun, Still Inferno, with illustration of Jacques Tardy, which is well known in France for his drawings on the First World War. I wanted also to talk about the way 2 other French designers, Morgane Gouillon-Réty and Fred Serval, got involved into the production of the Coin series. So Morgane made a great game with Pendragon, and Fred Serval just is about to release his Red Flag over Paris, which is a game you may know about the Paris Commune, and is also developing another game about Robin Hood, while Morgane is all working on Hubris, which is a game on Hellenistic conflicts. On the military side, because we are coming back to the military, Laurent Closier, Sébastien de Perret, I misspelled his name, sorry, Sébastien, and Pierre Razou made great games these last years. Laurent Closier made Phantom Fury, which is a game on Fallujah, on the battle for Fallujah. Pierre Razou, who worked at the École Militaire, has made Fitna, which is a game about the Middle East. Laurent Closier, I already talked about him, and Sébastien de Perret made a great game which is called Urban Ops, obviously on urban operations. Laurent Closier and Sébastien de Perret are more tactical games. Pierre Razou is more operational. So it brings us back to the French wargaming in the military today. After many years of neglect, the French army, the French Navy are becoming more and more interested into wargaming. Last year and the year after, and from now on, every 2nd of December, the École de Guerre at the École Militaire in Paris held an exercise which is called Pratzen on the Battle of Austerlitz. It's a staff exercise for what they call in Saint-Cyr the 2S, which is the great day for the Saint-Cyr school. And they make this exercise using Walter Wojciechowski Austerlitz Rising Eagle maps, but with more simple rules, because in fact, the main interest in this exercise, in this staff exercise, is not what happens on the table, but the circulation of information, orders, and reports from what happens on the table to the staff. So what happens is that the officers that you see move divisions around on the table, obeying orders that were given to them by their core staff officers, and the core staff officers were in their turn briefed by the general staff. You have 3 general staff on this exercise, the French, the Russian, and the Austrian. And so the fact that the Russian and the Austrian have 2 different staff creates sometimes some quirks on command. So what you see here is clearly a staff exercise game where information flows from the bottom to the top and from the top to the bottom with some distortion. And so the idea is to help the officers attending the École de Guerre to understand what happens when you have long chains of command and the differences or the problems that arise of command and control on this particular exercise. Last year, the coalition won a great victory, cutting the French army in 2. So it was not a very good day for the emperor. Was also was developed this year a matrix game. Basically, it was created by officers at the École de Guerre too. It's crisis simulation. So what is central here is a French regiment, which is in the department of the Essonne. The Essonne is a department just in the south of Paris. And so basically, it's a crisis simulation for the regiment and all these elements, transports, medical, etc. So you have a crisis, you have a scenario in the first place, and on every turn you have event cards that will add some crisis to the crisis. And the main objective of this war game, which is more a matrix game actually, is like any matrix game to allow people to gather around the table and to talk about things in a way that they would probably not be talking if they had a classical meeting. So it worked, it was tested and approved by the État-Major de l'Armée de Terre. And so we hope it's going to be very useful for the French army in the years to come. We are also, and I say we because I am part of this, and I was also part of the development of Simopole, the matrix game, developing what we call Duel Tactique, which is a war game developed also by the École de Guerre. In fact, it is developed by many officers that are studying at the École de Guerre this year. We are using hexagons, geomorphing maps. So we have 4 maps that we can assemble in almost any combination. And the main problem is that, as I said, there is no real tradition of wargaming in the French military. So most of the officers that are present at the École de Guerre are not very much familiar with wargaming. So we decided that it was perhaps best to center the game on doctrine, on the French doctrine, and on the missions. So basically, what you do when you use this game is you have to give every unit a mission: attack, defend, raid, whatsoever, and you have to comply. All missions give you bonuses and maluses, and so there is no such things as a perfect mission. You can change a mission, but it's really hard to change them in the course of the game. There is a fog of war, as you may see. We have all the counters have two sides. One side with a question mark, and the other side which is the unit. It could be electronic warfare, so it could be a dummy. And so we have a first, usually a preliminary phase of discovery and reconnaissance, and after that, the fighting. The idea was to produce a game which is not to be made too much complicated, and also a game that was that we would be able to play in something like 2 hours and a half at most for to be able to make a hot wash after the game, and to make so that we can have some conclusions on every game we have. This is a divisional and brigade scale, so most units are regiments or big battalions. You have some small units that can be attached to the units, like engineers and so on. And so the game is still in development, but it's almost done. And it has been very useful for everybody, because in fact lots of people were involved. Many officers were involved from many branches of the service, and it was very interesting for me to hear from them what was the doctrine, what was their vision of the use of their own branch, and how to translate it in game design. So wargaming is back, in fact, and has never been stronger in the army, and we have also lots of development even at the École de Guerre, which is different from the École de Guerre Terre. In the École de Guerre, you have the Armée de Terre, but you also have the French Navy and the French Air Force. In the illustration and the photographs you see here, it was an exercise last week, I guess. It was an exercise on the Loi de Programmation Militaire, which is basically the law that will define the money and the army will get and how it will spend it for the next 5 or 10 years. So all the officers were involved to make choices on this matter. And so wargaming is in constant development in the French military, and I'm glad to be part of this development. So I wanted just to end this small talk by a picture of the old Roman La Tranquillus game, because in fact, the more I'm studying the history of war games, the more I'm thinking, like I was saying in the beginning of my speech, that in fact, what we consider wargaming today makes us consider other games like the chess or so on, not proper war games, but proto-war games or games that were used to create war games. But I think that if you try to look on the long history of gaming, in fact, chess is just to older games what Helvig's game and then Reiswit's game was to Helvig's game. It was just a transformation. There were other games about war before chess. And so maybe the idea is that, you know, it's just like that. Well, thank you everyone for being here. I see that people asked a few things, and perhaps I would like to answer a few questions if you want. I can already answer the few questions that I see here. But Nick, if you want to say something first.
I was just going to read out those questions so we have them for the recording.
Okay, so yeah, feel free to.
Antoine, in your current review of historical and contemporary wargaming, how clear is the distinction between game played for competitive winning and games designed for teaching and learning? Additionally, has there been a historical separation between the two aims?
It is a very, very interesting question. I think that almost every game, almost every war game, commercial war games, for instance, can perfectly be used in a professional environment. As always, it depends on what do you want and what do you want to do. If you consider that at the core, wargaming is the chuck of the crossing of the wheels fighting each other. basically any game will do. But related to the French, to the war game we are developing currently with the French, within the French army, we are clearly on a more professional approach, and the more professional approach here is in the fact that we choose to use missions and doctrine as the center for the game. If it was a commercial game, and if you were to release it as a commercial war game, we probably won't be using planifications, because before the game you have to make a plan, you have to make ovos and so on, and so you have to make lots of planning, which all these officers are of course used to do, because it's their job. But people who just want to have some casual game are not familiar with that, and so I guess it is the main difference is that we are here in a professional environment, sorry, and in this professional environment, we are using some procedures that would be perhaps considered as too tedious for casual wargamers. I don't know if it answers the question, but.
Thank you. And then from Sebastian,
Yeah.
what do you think is the major characteristic about French wargaming and why?
I don't know. It's a very difficult question, actually. I can't say that there is much a French. I can't say there is a French school of rules, because most French designers are using tools that were developed many years ago. To quote Jim Denigan's famous phrase, so the first rule is to plagiarize, and the second is to keep it simple. And so many people, I do that also when I design some war games for my friends or the club, or at the time for the École de Guerre. It's plain plagiarism. So we are using receipts that work well and try to adapt them. So I can't say there is something like a real French way, but perhaps other French designers, perhaps Fred Serval or Morgan, will have a very different view and think that their French background have an impact on the way they are making games. I don't know. I can't say, actually, really.
I have one question for you. What is the current French, within the French security apparatus, what is the approach to counterinsurgency wargaming, particularly thinking about like the French intervention in the Sahel and Operation Barkhane?
Yeah, it's a very good question. War games were developed for many years, in fact, but usually there is something. Yeah, it's a bit. So maybe it's a bit of the French tradition, and maybe it's a characteristic of French wargaming. In fact, what I will say, there is in France, lots of people are really afraid in the military to be accused, and I really mean accused, to be playing and not to be working. So the term jeu, game in French, can be really problematic for many people, because they don't want to be seen as being not serious and not doing serious business, because they associate gaming with unseriousness, which is, in my view, totally absurd. But there is this kind of bias. And so it means that for many years, for instance, we didn't say jeu de guerre in the French military. We said manœuvre sur carte, map maneuver. And but we have also this problem on the civilian side, because, for instance, jeu de guerre was not very much used from the 70s on. It was more, the word was, or the expression was jeu d'histoire, history games, because the association of jeu, of game, and war was considered to be too much unsavory, to be used before the public. So many people, and there was in France, for instance, a federation of wargaming, and it was called La Fédération Française de Jeux d'Histoire, so the French Federation of History games and not of war games. So I really think we have problems with war, and we have problems with games here. So we have problems with war in the civilian circles, and we have problems with games in the military circles. But again, things are changing because people are more and more able to realize that, in fact, game has its virtues. We all know them, of course, and so the stigmata of the word game, jeu in French, is slowly fading, but it's still a touchy matter in the French military, really.
And I believe we have one more question from Sebastian as well.
Yeah.
What is something you see other countries doing in terms of wargaming that you want the French wargaming community to do?
Oh, it's a very important thing. I think one of the most important thing would be to be more inclusive. I think this is a tendency that we see. We have seen that with the Zenobia Award, for instance, which is a great step. And I used to say that, and it's still true, that you have so the proportion of women in the French military is rather low, not that low, but obviously there are more men than women in the French military. And but the proportion of women in the French wargaming community is even lower. It's always it's very difficult to have well, when you go to conventions in France, 99% of the people around the tables are white males, and well, as everybody says, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. So this is why when I published my book, so I published a book last year in French, which is called Jouer la Guerre, Playing War, History of Wargame, and I choose to have a woman in cover. It is a woman who was working during the Second World War in the Western Approaches Center, who was really a great center for naval warfare and fighting the U-boats that were a threat to the Atlantic transports. And I felt it was really important for me to do that. It was a political stance to have a woman, because I just wanted to send this message that women are welcomed. They are, and not only women. I mean, everybody is welcomed. Sebastian, what is the story
or fact about French wargaming that people do not know but should know? Sorry, Dan.
I don't know. I really think that Montbrison, the Jeux de la Guerre et de Terre de Montbrison, should be more known. Actually, it's really crazy. It's a really crazy book. It has a quixotic tone at some times. It is a rule. You have rule sets, but you have many digressions. It goes, you know, it's really a crazy book. And I really think that lots of people in France should read Bernard de Montbrison's book, because it's really important book. And in history, what I think, I didn't mention it, but we should remember the history of General Prétla. The General Prétla was a general of the French army, and he was in charge of the northern sector in 1938. And he was using war games. As I said, the French army at the time was not using war game in a systematical way, but some people in the institution were using war games. And General Prétla with his staff had a war game about a very stupid idea, but well, they wanted to have a test about it. What if the German armor tried to cross the border and going into the Ardennes and cross the French border at around Sedan? And so they did this war game, and the results were appalling. They just realized that if the German armor were to cross the Ardennes, they would probably be able to be on the Meuse about like 2 or 3 days, in maybe 3 or 4 days, sorry, 3 or 4 days. And so Pretla was much appalled. And so, of course, he informed his superiors. And one of his superiors was General Gamelin, which was the commander-in-chief of the French army. And General Gamelin said that it was very interesting. So he did not reject the conclusions of Pretla's war game. But, he said, it shouldn't be a problem, because if the Germans try to cross the border at that time, we'll just get our reserves there and we'll just fix them and they won't be able to get out. But the main problem is that on the 10th of May 1940, when the German army begins its invasion, the General Gamelin sends all his reserves in the north in Belgium. And so when 4 days later, the German army tries to cross the Meuse, there is no more reserves. And so, well, you know what happened next. So basically, wargaming can save lives, at least French. I see also Augustine send a question.
Yes, considering the military conceptualizations of the level of war, tactical, operational, strategic, and political, what are the limits within these levels on the usefulness of war games? I mean, the higher the level, everything is less prescriptive and more difficult to generate applicable theories.
Well, the main thing here is I really don't think that wargame is about generate applicable theories. I really don't. I do think that wargaming is a fantastic tool for training. It's a fantastic tool for identifying issues, but I think it's not a great tool to generate applicable theories. Because every game has a bias, as you may know, because we all have bias and wargame designers have bias. And we are, want it or not, injecting this bias into our game designs. So I guess that, yeah, to me, the main purpose of wargaming is to train people. And when you use them in a professional way, of course, is to train people and to identify issues.
I think we'll just hold out one more minute.
If you don't have any question, I would like to thank, of course, Sebastian for inviting me. I would also like to thank the Georgetown University. I am so sorry I wasn't able to make this presentation with my full USAR uniform, but I had something for you because, you know, I did my basic training at the 4th Regiment of USAR. And so this is my badge. I will show it to you. Up, you may see it. So this is the badge of the 4th Regiment of USAR, where I did my basic training. So I'm sorry. Next time I'll be with my full Kolpak and dolman, I swear.
Well, thank you very much, Antoine, for joining us, and have a nice day. It was great to host you all here for this event.
It was really great. Sorry for my broken English again. And well, thank you.